Okay, let's go ahead and get started tonight. We are in First Chronicles chapter 4, or First Kings rather, chapter 14. The parallel account is in Second Chronicles chapter 12, and we're beginning tonight with the death of King Rehoboam. You may recall we had talked about the death of Jeroboam last week, how that it was foretold that his dynasty, his lineage would not stand. One of the characteristics that distinguishes the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, from the kings of Judah, the southern kingdom, is that every couple of generations, if not more frequently, the dynasty, the ruling family in Israel changes, usually through assassination. In Judah, you have one continuous, unbroken family line, the family of David, throughout the history of the kings of Judah. So this is one of the fundamental distinctions between the two kingdoms. Even though they're side by side, even though they're family, remember that with Jeroboam, when God selected him, he basically said to him, look, I will establish your kingdom. I'll make it as secure as David's if you will be faithful to me. And of course, the first thing Jeroboam did was turn aside and direct his nation into idolatry. And so all bets were off. And God then sends Ahijah to tell him, look, your lineage is not going to last. Now, his son, Nadab, rules after him. But where Jeroboam rules about 20 odd years, 22 if memory serves me, Nadab rules for 2 years. And we'll see him assassinated by Baasha in just a little bit. In the meantime, come down to 1 Kings chapter 14. At verse 21, Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. And here is where we figure out that apparently Pharaoh's daughter was not Solomon's first wife, because it's after Solomon becomes king, it appears to be after Solomon becomes king, that he marries Pharaoh's daughter and builds her house and then begins to collect brides, as it were. But Solomon reigns for 40 years. Look at verse 21 in 1 Kings chapter 14. And Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. He was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years. He was born the year before Solomon became king, which would seem to imply that somewhere in his youth, Solomon must have married a nice girl, except we're going to discover that the mother of Rehoboam is actually not a nice Jewish girl. She's an Ammonite woman named Naamah. He reigns for 17 years. And one of the things that's worth noting is that the queen mother of each king in Judah is named. Now that tells us a couple of things. It tells us, number one, the power, the influence that a wife has over her husband, that she influences him to put her son on the throne. Every one of these kings, basically, almost all of them have multiple wives. And so this does testify to the influence of the wife's power over the husband to some degree. But more so, it speaks of the mother's influence over her son. As she trains him, so goes the nation. Well, that may go a long way toward explaining Rehoboam's foolishness. His mother is an Amorite woman. Well, the Amorites are not particularly friendly, helpful, or loyal to Israel, to Judah. And so, despite Solomon's wisdom in his early years, at any rate, Rehoboam doesn't seem to have inherited a lot of that. We look and compare the reigns of Solomon and Rehoboam. Solomon is what? He starts out with the blessings of God, the wisest ordinary human in all of human history. courtesy of God. His successor, his own son, turns out to be, in some ways, one of the dumbest kings, one of the most foolish, arrogant kings that Judah will ever have. Now, later kings will certainly give him a run for the money for that title. But Rehoboam's claim to fame in history is that he was so bullheaded and arrogant that he caused the division of the nation. Well, skip on down to verse 29 here in chapter 14, and notice we talked a little bit last week. In the 5th year of Rehoboam, Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up and looted the treasury and took the golden overlaid shields that Solomon had made. Rehoboam replaces them with brass and then stores the brass shields in the guard room as if they're something tremendously precious. But get down to verse 29, all the rest of the acts of Rehoboam, all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continuously. Rehoboam slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite, and Abijam, or Abijah, as he's called in 2 Chronicles, his son, reigned in his stead. Now, one of the things that we might note by way of parallel over in 2 Chronicles chapter 12 at verse 15, in describing Rehoboam, we find a very similar statement. The acts of Rehoboam, first and last, are they not written in the histories of Shemaiah the prophet and of Iddo the seer after the manner of genealogies? Where do we find the histories of Shemaiah the prophet and Iddo the seer? You find them mentioned in Chronicles, but you don't have a record of them. They are not books that we have handed down to us. So, Rehoboam built fortifications. Rehoboam wanted to make his son Abijah king. You look at 2 Chronicles chapter 11, just back up a little bit, and notice in 2 Chronicles chapter 11, in verse 22, he had every intention of making his son king. Rehoboam appointed Abijah, the son of Maacah, as chief prince among his brothers, for he intended to make him king. He dealt wisely and distributed some of his sons throughout all the districts of Judah and Benjamin and all the fortified cities, gave them abundant provisions, and procured wives for them. He did something smart on one level. He had a house full of sons, and rather than repeat the competition, the struggle, the strife that had attended David's household, he scattered his sons out as they got old enough. He separated them from each other, gave them each responsibilities, a fiefdom to oversee and so forth. Basically, he kept them away from each other where they wouldn't be able to conveniently fuss and feud and fight and scheme amongst themselves against one another. So there are some things he did that were not entirely dumb. But Judah sins as a result of his influence, and God is angered. You look at 2 Chronicles chapter 12, you look at verse 1, verse 14. He didn't take away the high places. He didn't take away sacred pillars, the place where supposed revelations came. There were perverted people there, sodomites, homosexuals. All of the evils practiced by the heathens were present in Judah during his reign, even though Judah is nominally the faithful kingdom. So for whatever good we might acknowledge in Rehoboam, there's plenty of not so good as well. So you flip over to 1 Kings chapter 15, and now we're going to move from Rehoboam to Abijah, or Abijam, same person. And you look at verses 1, 2, and 3, things are not good in Judah. Abijam began to reign over Judah, reigned for 3 years. His mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom, and he walked in all the sins that his father did before him. His heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem, setting up his son after him, establishing Jerusalem because of what David had done. So, Abijah or Abijam, not an improvement. If anything, takes the nation farther away from God. Enmity continues, strife continues between Judah and Israel down here in verses 6 and 7. You find a description of war between Abijah and Jeroboam. Now remember, Rehoboam actually dies before Jeroboam does, even though Jeroboam's death is recorded first in 1 Kings. Abijah becomes king, reigns for 3 years, which leads up to the last year of Jeroboam's life in Israel. There is war between them. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 13, there's a good bit of detail, verses 3 through 20. Jeroboam and Israel come to the battle, come to conflict with twice as many men. And they lose 500,000 men. They're defeated. But you look at 2 Chronicles 13, and guess what? Abijah dies. Verses 22 to chapter 14, verse 1, Abijah only has 3 years on the throne, and then he dies and is replaced by his son Asa as king of Judah. Now, look back to 1 Kings chapter 15 for a moment. At verse 6, there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all the days of his life. And when it mentions Rehoboam here, even though Abijah is already on the throne, this is the house of Rehoboam. There was war between them all their days. The rest of the acts of Abijah, written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. Now we have a reference that may anticipate the books we know as Chronicles. This may also simply be a record to a reference to the civil record or the civil history of the nation of Judah, which pretty much every kingdom does that. The United States has its own official record, the Annals of the United States, that is compiled year by year, detailing all the activities, laws, legislation, events in the history of the nation. And you can find a copy of it and read it if you want to. It's dull. It's history told as dry facts and figures, not history told as the story of people. Anyhow, you've got this record. Abijah slept with his fathers, they buried him in the city of David, and Asa, his son, reigns in his stead, reigns in his place. And notice what is said about Asa. You pick up at verse 9. He reigns 41 years in Jerusalem. Well, at this point, Asa is going to hold the record for longest reign. He won't hold it indefinitely, but so far, he's going to excel Saul, David, and Solomon for time. His mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. Wait a minute. Isn't that the same woman who was Abijah's mother?
This version says the granddaughter of Abishalom.
Okay. You have two possibilities here. One, we're actually dealing with the grandchild, granddaughter, and so forth. Two, Abijah and Asa are brothers rather than father and son. Look over to 2 Chronicles, and you find his mother's name was Micaiah, the daughter of Uriel of Gibeah. How do we explain the discrepancy?
Second Chronicles, what chapter?
2 Chronicles chapter 12, chapter 13 rather, verse 1 and 2. Now, in Kings, the same mother's name is used for Abijah. How do we explain the distinction? Well, she's probably still living when Abijam dies. He only reigned 3 years. There is no mention of Asa's mother as being anyone else here. You have Abijah in 1 Kings 14 and Abijam in 2 Chronicles 13. When he dies, his mother is credited as Asa's mother. How so? Possibly they're brothers. Possibly Asa's mother, biological mother, Abijam's wife, died as a young woman. Either way, Maacah would seemingly be the influence on both of these men. But notice the difference in behavior. Asa is a righteous man, a good king. Look down to chapter 15 in verse 8. Asa, his son, reigned in his place. In the 20th year of Jeroboam, Asa began to reign over Judah, reigned 41 years. His mother's name, given the same as Abijam. But at verse 11, Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He put away the homosexuality that was pervasive among the idolaters in the land. The English Standard actually says he put away the male cult prostitutes out of the land. He removed the idols that his fathers had made. He also removed Maacah, his mother, from being queen mother because she had made an abominable image for Asherah. He removed her for idolatry. The high places were not removed, and that may be a reference not to idolatry, but to places where sacrifices and offerings were made to the Lord, and that may account for why they were not removed. But go on down to 2 Chronicles chapter 14, and what do we find him doing here? Like Rehoboam, he's building fortified cities. He is trying to secure his kingdom against the threats and the problems that Jeroboam and later Nadab and Rehoboam and later Abijah have left him. One of the reasons that Shishak had been able to come up from Egypt and loot the treasury and loot the temple treasury was that there was no defense against them. Apparently, of course, the Egyptians also came with a profoundly large army, and they came not as occupiers, but basically as looters and raiders, marauders, and then they took what they wanted and went home, which was actually uncommon for such a large nation in that day. Typically, large empire scale nations wanted to occupy and put smaller nations to tribute. There's no indication of Shishak doing that, and it may have been in part because of the distance involved and so forth. But you look at 2 Chronicles chapter 14, verses 6 through 8, he builds walled cities, defendable cities in Judah. And notice it says the land was quiet. He had no war in those years. He made many, many gifts to the Lord. Look back here to chapter 15 in 1 Kings. At verse 15, he brought into the house of the Lord the sacred gifts of his father and his own sacred gifts, silver, gold, vessels. So up to this point, things are peaceful. Now you get to verse 16, and now there's been a change in administration in Israel, the northern kingdom. Baasha has assassinated Nadab, the son of Jeroboam. And so just as Ahijah foretold, Jeroboam's lineage, Jeroboam's dynasty comes to an end right there. It's cut off. And Baasha becomes the new king. And of course, he has in mind to establish his lineage, his dynasty. Every king has pretensions of greatness and visions of grandeur and ideas that his kingdom is going to last 1,000 years and his great grandson is going to rule and we're just going to build and build and build and build and I'll get the credit as the lion that founded it and everything is built on me and so on and so forth. Ego plays a big part in ruling a kingdom, doesn't it? Or ruining a kingdom, as the case may be. But Asa seems to have escaped a lot of this. Come down to verse 16 in 1 Kings 15, though. Now that Baasha has become king in Israel, now we've got friction. Why would Baasha go to war with Asa after there's been a brief period, at least several years of peace? If you think about it, as he is trying to cement his hold on the 10 tribes, what better way can he do that? Establish himself as the ruler than by giving them a focal point for their energy, giving them a focal point for all of their efforts, giving them a common foe to rally against. You look at the current circumstances in the world today, and you've got all of the disparate nations of Western Europe, and Canada, and the United States, and we all have our differing national agendas and policies, don't we? And Vladimir Putin has focused a whole lot of common attention among these normally quarrelsome and disagreeable and not particularly helpful to each other nations. Well, they've put a whole lot of that aside, haven't they, in order to focus on a common threat. Well, that's basically what Baasha is doing in trying to cement his role as king over the 10 tribes. He gives them a common enemy, in a sense. Judah, those self-righteous worshipers of Jehovah. And so there's war. Notice one of the things he does. He went up and built Ramah, that he might permit no one to go out or come in to Asa, king of Judah. Well, where is Ramah? Geographically, where is Ramah? Ramah's in Ephraim. Ramah is north of Jerusalem. And what the king here is doing is basically going to his southern border and building a fortified city that cuts off trade access and cuts off convenient access for anybody to Jerusalem. How so? Think about the geography of Jerusalem for just a minute. The city of Jerusalem is basically the highest point in the promised land. It's uphill from any direction to get to Jerusalem. And so if this is north, the city of Jerusalem here, the marker's about half dead. The city of Jerusalem sits at the confluence of two valleys, the Kidron Valley and the Hinnom Valley. And here's the city. Access, for all practical purposes, to the city of Jerusalem is from the north. You can get to Jerusalem from the south, the west, or the east. But if you come from the west, you have to scale steep mountains up to the west side of Jerusalem. If you come from the south, you have to go down and cross the Hinnom Valley and then basically climb up almost a sheer cliff. And the same if you come directly from the east, across the Kidron Valley, you have to go down and then climb up the cliff that would form the foundation of the temple. So the only convenient access is from the north. And by building Ramah up here in the north, what he's doing is restricting access. Even people coming from the west, the east, and the south would normally circle around and approach the city from the north because that's the easy route. So what Baasha is doing is basically trying to isolate the king of Judah from his own people. Now, if he can hem him in, that's H-E-M, hem him in like a bird in a cage, what can he do to the rest of the nation? He can basically dictate to a whole lot of Judah whatever he wants to. So he sets about to lock Asa up. Now look what Asa does. Come down to 1 Kings chapter 15 and look, begin at verse 18. Asa does something that kind of boomerangs on him. It's an exception to his normal pattern of behavior. You pick up at verse 18, he took all the silver and gold left in the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house and gave them into the hands of his servants and sent them to Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, in Damascus. Well, where's Damascus? Where is Syria? Well, let's erase all of this scribbling. And get a little better idea of where everything is.
You want a map?
Beg your pardon?
You want me to go get a map? I got a big map.
No, we'll do that next time. If this is the Mediterranean coast, we've got Mount Carmel right here. Here are the Anti-Lebanon and Lebanon mountains. You have the River Jordan flowing down the little lake up here, and then Galilee right here. River Jordan flows down to the Dead Sea down here. Jerusalem right here. The border between Jerusalem and between Judah and Israel, just north of Jerusalem. Ramah would be right about here. Where is Syria? If this is Judah, and this is Israel, Syria is up here. And remember, Israel's territory extends around like that over onto the east side of the Jordan River. Now, I don't know how well those of you online can see that. It's just scribbling on the board. But at any rate, Syria is to the north and east of Israel. They're on the opposite border, basically, from Judah. So Asa bribes Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, to break a covenant, to break a treaty with Baasha and come over to his side. Go break your covenant with Baasha, king of Israel, that he may withdraw from me. Look, I'll pay you to pressure him on the other side of his country to give me some breathing space. So that's what he does. Ben-Hadad listened to King Asa, sent the commanders of armies against the cities of Israel, and conquered Ijon, Dan, Abel, Beth Maacah, and all of Chinneroth, and all the land of Naphtali. So what Ben-Hadad does is he comes down in here and he takes over a lot of this area around the Sea of Galilee. Well, that's a pretty serious incursion into Baasha's territory. And he can't just let that go unanswered, so he has to withdraw his troops from the border with Judah in order to go deal with that. Well, that gives Asa the breathing room that he needs to put a stop to this effort to cut him off from his own people. Notice what they did. In verse 22, King Asa made a proclamation to all Judah, none was exempt, and they carried away the stones of Ramah and its timber, with which Baasha had been building, and with them King Asa built Geba of Benjamin and Mizpah. So what they did was they went up here into the territory of Israel, just across the border, and they confiscated all the building material, basically, and they carried it down here to the southern side and built fortified cities down there where, if anything, it would serve them for a little bit of protection against maybe incursions from the Egyptians, the Edomites, Moabites, others who were on that south side. So that brings us in 1 Kings to the end of Asa's reign. The rest of the acts of Asa, all his might, all that he did, the cities that he built, they're written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. But in his old age, he was diseased in his feet. And Asa slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. Now, you would think there was more to the story here, because he's a righteous king. He's done good so far. Asa had trouble with Baasha, partly because Baasha had ambition. But turn over to 2 Chronicles for a moment. And in chapter 16, what do we discover? In 2 Chronicles chapter 16, this is late in Asa's life, 36th year of the reign of Asa. Baasha went up and built Ramah. So this is just 5 years before he's going to die that this actually takes place. They break the covenant between Baasha and Ben-Hadad. And come down here to verse 7 in 2 Chronicles 16. Said there was more to the story. Here's the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say. Hanani, whatever, the seer came to Asa, king of Judah, and said to him, because you relied on the king of Syria and did not rely on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Syria has escaped you. Well, that seems like a peculiar thing to say, because where's the army of the king of Syria? Well, he's way over here on the other side of Israel. He doesn't even border Judah, really. From Asa's point of view, the army of the king of Syria, the Syrians, Ben-Hadad wasn't really an active threat to him. But notice, keep going. We're not the Ethiopians and the Libyans, a huge army with very many chariots and horsemen. Yet because you relied on the Lord, he gave them into your hand. The eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to give strong support to those whose heart is blameless toward him. Well, there's a sermon in that statement, isn't there? But then he says, you've done foolishly in this, for from now on you will have wars. Well, he's only got 5 years, 6 years to go, 5 years to go. This is the 36th year. He's only going to reign 41. So he's already an old man, and he's running out of sand. But nevertheless, look at his response to the prophet's words, to the seer's words in verse 10. Asa was angry with the seer and put him in the stocks in prison. He was in a rage because of this and inflicted cruelties upon some of the people at the same time. Boy, things have changed all of a sudden, haven't they?
Feet hurt.
Yep. His feet hurt. You know, when your feet hurt,
Yes,
nothing feels good, right?
Hurts.
His feet hurt. Well, there's some truth to that. Or is it? Is he mad because his feet hurt? Or look, just keep going. You get down here to verse 12. In the 39th year of his reign, he was diseased in his feet. The disease became severe. So that apparently he didn't react that way because his feet hurt. He reacted that way because he didn't like what the seer said. What took place that would cause him? He's been good all this time. Why would he turn aside now, late in life? There's no explanation other than he didn't like what God's man said. Maybe he has come to the point that he believes his own press, believes his own invincibility. Maybe he's more focused on trying to secure his legacy or what have you, and less focused on God. But we get down here at year 39, 2 years before he dies. Now he's got trouble in his feet. And notice what it says about that here in 2 Chronicles 16. Even in his disease, he did not seek the Lord, but sought help from physicians. Somewhere in there, Asa, the good king who had the long reign, somewhere in there, he got off track, didn't he? And so he slept with his fathers, dying in the 41st year of his reign. And they buried him, laid him on a bier, and so on and so forth, made a very great fire in his honor.
Maybe he blamed God for his disease. Maybe he was mad about that. You know,
He may have.
It sounds like he was seeking physicians. He was desperate to fix this problem.
Now, when his feet hurt, he's desperate. You're right. Why doesn't he turn to the Lord? Well, maybe he is angry at God. We don't know. But the fact that he reacted badly to the correction that God sent him through Hanani the seer tells us that somewhere late in his reign, he's begun to get off track with God. And when you get off track with God, what happens? Things don't go well. Think about the individuals that you've known in the course of your life, Christians who have allowed themselves to be separated from God by some event or some reverse or some difficulty or some challenge in their lives. And rather than recognizing, I need to get back and get right with God, they try to deal with it on their own. They try to cope with it on their own. They try to fight their way through it on their own. And what happens? Doesn't it seem like difficulties and challenges just multiply for them? I get past one problem and another one crops up. And another one and another one. And from the outside looking in, we're able to look at this and say, look, if you'll get your life right with God, if you'll get back where you ought to be, then these things will resolve themselves. But what do some of these folks do? You take your eyes off of God and you focus your eyes on the problem in front of you and let it obscure your view. And it gets in the way of your relationship with God, doesn't it? Maybe that's what happened to Asa.
I think what I'm getting from this is you can't take your foot off the gas. I mean, you see these guys,
Okay.
you see Solomon, you see Asa, you see Elijah, his sons, you see like, man, they did right up to the end. You know, you can't just rest on your laurels, right? I did all these other good things.
Yeah.
That we can't get satisfied, comfortable
Okay.
with ourselves and what we've done in the past, because we've got to stay focused to the end.
Okay, point is well taken. Michael Holland is, for those of you online, in a nutshell, what he says is this shows that when you're doing right, don't take your foot off the gas. Every time these guys slow down, back off, get distracted, it boomerangs on them, it backfires on them, it doesn't do well. As long as they stay focused and keep pushing forward with God, things go well. And the same holds true for us, doesn't it?
Be weary and well doing.
There you go, Galatians 6 and verse 9. Do not be weary in well-doing. Well, Asa dies, and Jehoshaphat, his son, becomes king in his place and strengthened himself against Israel. He placed forces in all the fortified cities of Judah and set garrisons in the land of Judah and in the cities of Ephraim that Asa, his father, had captured. And the Lord was with him because he walked with the Lord. So there's a change in rulership in Judah. But long before that happened, long before we're done with Asa, what takes place? Go back over to 1 Kings chapter 15 or chapter 16 and pick up at verse 8. In the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, Elah, the son of Baasha, began to reign over Israel in Tirzah, and he reigned 2 years. So Baasha is out of the way long before Asa comes to his conclusion. Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, had been an evil king. Baasha had murdered Nadab and every member of Jeroboam's family, which, by the way, God had predicted back in 1 Kings chapter 14. Strife had continued. Baasha was no better than Jeroboam. He was no improvement morally or spiritually. And judgment is given in chapter 16. Look at verses 1 through 4 in chapter 16 of 1 Kings. Concerning Baasha, the word of the Lord came to Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha. Since I exalted you out of the dust and made you leader over my people, and you've walked in the way of Jeroboam, here's what I'm going to do. I will utterly sweep away Baasha and his house. I'll make your house like the house of Jeroboam, the son of me. In other words, I'm going to do to you what you did to Jeroboam. Anybody of your family that dies in the city, the dogs will eat, scavengers. Anybody of your family that dies out in the open country, carrion birds will eat. You know, it's interesting. There aren't very many state funerals for kings of Judah, or kings of Israel, rather, are there? You think about that. When a usurper comes along and assassinates the sitting king, he doesn't generally give him a big send-off, does he? Because he doesn't want to credit him in any way or in any way empower either his family or his followers. So we have Baasha taken out of the way. Elah, his son, reigns, and just as Jeroboam, Baasha's house is about to be cut off. What do we know about Baasha and his descendants? Just like Jeroboam. No improvement at all. When we look at the moral history of the kings of Judah, we see them bounce like a ping pong ball. Good one, bad one, good one, bad one, good one, bad one, bad one, bad one, good one, bad one, good one, good one, bad one. When you look at the moral, spiritual history of the kings of Israel, from Jeroboam forward, it's just a fast decline. There are no good kings in Israel. Not one. Baasha's wickedness proves that his exterminating Jeroboam's family was done out of his own selfish interests. It was not done as a righteous act under God's direction, even though it was God's will. And because Baasha was acting for his own interests without consideration of God's will, what do we find God doing? God condemns him for his motivation in these acts, even though the actions were the fulfillment of God's will. So we come down here, we find that Elah reigns for 2 years and is cut off. Zimri, who is one of his military commanders, he's not even, he's a high-ranking commander, but he's not even the chief of staff. He's in charge of half the chariots. And you think about the chariots, the cavalry, that's not even the major part of the army. That's a comparatively minor part of the army. The army would number hundreds of thousands of men. The chariot corps, the cavalry, chariots would be like heavy cavalry, basically, the precursor of mobile artillery in a sense. They would number not in the hundreds of thousands, but in the thousands, probably not even in the tens of thousands. So this guy is in charge of half of the chariot corps. And in Tirzah, what's Elah doing? 2 years in, he is drunk as a hoot owl, drinking himself drunk in the house of Arza, who's his major domo, basically. And Zimri murders him, assassinates him, came in and struck him down and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah. So he doesn't even complete 2 full years, evidently. He reigns over the course of 2 years, 26th to 27th years of Asa, but doesn't even complete 24 months, apparently. And Zimri assassinates him. So here's the prophecy being fulfilled all over again, second generation. Notice when he began to reign, as soon as he seated himself on his throne, he struck down all the house of Baasha, did not leave him a single male of relatives or friends. If you were on his side, this guy acts kind of like Hitler did in the wake of the attempts on his life late in World War II. If you even were friendly to the guy, you were in danger, and he killed him. But in the meantime, what else is going on? Zimri has appointed himself king, but not too many folks had a say in that matter, did they? So the people of Israel, most of whom are not present there at Tirzah, where are they? The army is actually besieging Gibbethon over here on the coast in the Phoenician Philistine territory. The army doesn't accept him as new king. And they coalesce around another leader in the army, Omri, and they turn and march on Tirzah. Who does this guy think he is to appoint himself king over us? Seems to be the attitude that they bring to the discussion, shall we say. Now, Zimri is in a fortified position, but he doesn't have an army at his disposal. Who does he have? He's got himself, maybe he's got his immediate troops, the charioteers that he commanded, but they're a small number compared to the whole army. And so Omri brings the army and they lay siege to Tirzah, and Zimri has he doesn't have a ghost of a prayer of a chance to overcome them and survive this. Zimri reigns a grand total of a week. And when he sees that he cannot escape or prevail, well, then I'll just burn the house down on top of myself. And that's exactly what he does. He burns down the king's house. Now, I don't know if we could call it really a palace or not, but certainly it's a large facility, and he sets fire to it and burns it down over himself. And that's the end of Zimri. And the acts of Zimri and the conspiracy that, Look down here at verse 20. What's his claim to fame? Treason, conspiracy. The treason that he made, they're written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. We don't have that book. It didn't survive. God didn't see fit to preserve it for us.
That's not Chronicles?
No,
Did you say that?
no. The books that we know as First and Second Chronicles cover almost exclusively the kings of Judah. And as we pointed out, they're written largely from a priestly point of view. And the focus of what we call First and Second Chronicles is to demonstrate the overall legitimacy and, generally speaking, the nominal faithfulness of Judah and her kings to God. Now, it's kind of hard to make that claim when so many of them turn out to be such scoundrels and such unspiritual men. But it does emphasize this is the legitimate lineage of the Savior all the way through. A contiguous lineage. No breaks. The books of the Chronicles of Israel, that would be the annals of the northern kingdom, the history, the official history of what happened, which may well have survived until that time, but we don't have them. So, Omri captures Tirzah, Zimri burns down the palace over himself, and everything's hunky-dory. Not exactly. The army is with Omri, or at least the army that was with him at Gibbethon was, but not all of the people of Israel accept him. Some of them prefer somebody named Tibni or Tibni. And these two, we might call them co-regents in the sense that they both reign simultaneously, but they're not reigning in harmony with each other. They're in competition with each other. So the divided kingdom, Judah and Israel, becomes further divided temporarily, Israel under Omri and Israel under Tibni, until Omri is able to vanquish Tibni and his forces. Well, you take into account that evidently Omri was a military commander before he began to be king, and at the time that he began to lay claim to the throne of Israel, who did he have at his disposal? Well, apparently he had all the army that had been gathered at Gibbethon to fight the Phoenicians or the Philistines there. So he's already in a pretty good situation to lay claim to the throne. Tibni doesn't seem to have the resources at his disposal. And so Tibni is vanquished. Omri becomes the undisputed king. And you look down here in 1 Kings chapter 16 to verses 23 and 24, and here is where Samaria comes into view. Up to this time, there had been no distinct capital to Israel, to the northern kingdom. The previous couple of kings have lived in Tirzah. Well, Zimri kind of paid to that whole idea because he burned down whatever palace there was there with himself inside. And so Omri, who reigns about 12 years, halfway through that reign, buys from Shemer a hill, a city, and builds the city of Samaria or Samaria. And that becomes, from this point forward, the defined capital of the northern kingdom, Israel, the 10 tribes. And from this point forward, then, in Hebrew history, we see the terms Israel and Samaria sometimes used interchangeably, Samaria being a reference to all of the northern kingdom, because that's the capital. Think about in world news reporting, how often the United States is referred to not as the United States, but our policies are referred to by the capital city. Washington says this or that. Well, what do we actually mean by that? The official policy of the United States is thus and such and so and so. But where does that policy emanate? The mouthpiece is Washington. Well, in Israel, the mouthpiece now becomes Samaria. And it will remain the capital until it is destroyed by the Assyrians in 721. But look down at verses 25 through 28. Come down here almost to the end of the chapter, next to the last paragraph. Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did more evil than all who were before him. He was the worst yet. But just like the pitch man on TV says, but wait, there's more. Look at his son. Yeah. He excelled everybody from Jeroboam forward, but his son's going to make him look like a piker by comparison. He provokes the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger with his idolatry, slept with his fathers, and finally, what do we have? A state funeral in Israel. He's buried in Samaria. Well, that's because he wasn't overthrown. His son reigns in his place. The 38th year of Asa, king of Judah. Oh, here comes Ahab. And no, he's not an Arab. Ray Stevens notwithstanding. Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. Well, I guess he learned, I won't say learned well, but he seems to have learned thoroughly from his father's example. He followed his father's footsteps. And if it had been a light thing, as if it wasn't enough for Jeroboam to introduce idolatry, what does Ahab do? He imports more idolatry. He marries a Sidonian princess, Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshiped him. So he imports outright foreign idolatry, the very idolatry that Moses and Joshua were tasked to stamp out in the land of promise. Well, guess what? In the days of Joshua and the judges, every single tribe stopped short of finishing the job. Even the tribe of Judah. Remember that in the days of the judges, the tribe of Judah didn't fully control all of their territory. The Jebusites still occupied what would become the city of Jerusalem. And they were not of Judah. They were idolaters, needed to be wiped out, and eventually were. Now Ahab imports the very vile false religions that led to God expelling all of those other people, the Hittites and the Hivites and the Perizzites and so forth, in the days of Joshua. And what had Joshua warned them? What had Moses warned them before that? When you go into the promised land, if you do this, if you adopt this worship, if you adopt these idols, what's going to happen to you? He says literally, I will cause the land to vomit you out, just as I have caused it to vomit these people out because of their sin, because of their idolatry. So, what has Ahab just done?
Made God angry.
Ahab has just ensured the demise of the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom. Now it's going to take another couple hundred years before it actually gets there. But he has brought in the very thing that God said would assure their destruction, this kind of idolatry. Now, Ahab sets the tone for how the nation of Israel is going to go. And the first indication of this after his marriage and his idolatry comes at the very end of 1 Kings chapter 16. You look at verse 34. In his days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. Go back to Joshua chapter 6 and verse 26. When the children of Israel crossed the Jordan River at Gilgal, just north of the Dead Sea, and they come into the plains of Jericho, what's the first Canaanite city they come to? Jericho. And what instructions does God give concerning Jericho in Joshua chapter 6? Destroy it, demolish it, don't take anything from it. It's devoted, it's consecrated. In other words, it's the first fruits of your conquest of the land. It belongs to me. And when you're done with it, leave its ruins alone. Now, God is going to bring the walls tumbling down, as the old spiritual song says. And the army gathers around. They march around the city every day for 7 days. 7 times on the 7th day, they blow the trumpets. They give a shout. The walls collapse. Every man turns left face, and boom, into the city they go. And who survives? Rahab's household, because she hid the spies. And she winds up in the lineage of the king, by the way. And not just the king, but the king. But in the meantime, everybody else there, man, woman, and child, livestock, and everything, are slaughtered. They're not to take a thing. Of course, we know about Achan and his foolishness, and how that cost 36 innocent Israeli or Hebrew soldiers' lives before they got that all straightened out. But in Joshua chapter 6, at verse 26, having overcome the city, Joshua now pronounces a curse on the city. Cursed be the man who rebuilds this city. In the laying of the foundation, he'll pay with the life of his firstborn son. And when he rears up, when he sets up the gates of the city, it'll cost him his youngest son. And so we get over here, and 550 years later, Hiel the Bethelite built Jericho, laid its foundations at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun. 550 years later, that curse, that prophecy, is fulfilled to the letter. But now we come 1 Kings 17. And we get to meet Elijah. I like Elijah. Elijah is one of my favorite prophets. Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. Well, guess what? Now we got a drought. And when you've got a drought, what follows on its heels? Famine. Because when you've got a drought, you're not going to produce grain. And when you don't produce grain, you can't feed the livestock. And you can't make bread. And you can't have a cookout because the livestock aren't worth slaughtering. They're too skinny to make a good steak. Things are going to get tough. And when it goes on and goes on and goes on, Ahab is not a happy camper. Well, there's a little insight that we gain from the New Testament about this. Because here it just appears that Elijah merely prophesied this. But guess what? There's a little more to the story than this, because what does James tell us about this? James tells us Elijah was a man of like passions as we are, and he did what? He prayed, and it did not rain for 3.5 years. And he prayed again, and the heaven gave forth rain. Do you suppose James is trying to teach us something about the efficacy of prayer? How often do we shortchange ourselves by neglecting to pray or by not praying in faith? But here, it's not going to rain, King. Now, there's a little more to this. In our time, it's just about time for us to take a break. But before we do, let me point something out here. The word of the Lord came to him, said, "Depart from here, turn eastward, and hide yourself by the brook Kerith, which is east of the Jordan." So Elijah is in Israel, among the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom. Let's think about that for a minute. Who do these people worship? They worship golden calves at Dan and Bethel. They have a priesthood where anybody of whatever tribe, whatever caliber of person who wants to be the sorriest, most underhanded, base person can be a priest. They have run out the faithful Levites from their territory. They don't want them there, so a lot of them wind up going to Judah. But then Ahab has added to that and imported false worship that has no place in the land, the worship of Baal and the Asherah. These are male and female counterpart fertility gods. Baal, the male, the Asherah, the female. Jezebel has 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. And what does God do with these people? He sends them a prophet. They're ignoring him on an industrial scale. Now, not every German during World War II was a Nazi. There was an active resistance movement all through Hitler's rule in Germany. Not every Russian, not every Soviet citizen in the days of Stalin was a communist. There were dissidents and protesters even in Stalin's day. Not every Chinese person in the days of Mao Zedong or every Vietnamese in North Vietnam were committed communists. There were resistance movements there too. Not every Israelite in Israel was a devoted idol worshiper. Who is Ahab's chief of staff? No, that's his wife. Ahab's right-hand man is a guy named Obadiah. And Obadiah is a man who fears the Lord. And not only that, he's a man who hides out 100 faithful prophets of the Lord and provides for them to protect them from Jezebel. This nation is ignoring God, provoking God on an industrial scale, but because not absolutely every one of them is a faithless wretch, what does God do? He sends them what from our perspective has to be in some ways the most entertaining prophet in all of Scripture. He sends them Elijah. And boy, aren't we going to have fun with Elijah after the break. Questions or comments before we take a 15-minute break? Okay, it is 7:16. We'll reconvene at 7:31. Let's
It was peaceful and quiet.
All the night
you get a good nap,
I mean,
Mike.
that-
Oh, yes. It was peaceful and
It was me and
quiet.
Susan, we were all upstairs.
You would do
Uh,
it. Said, oh.
all right.
We were in.
We had just introduced Elijah. And so Elijah comes and tells Ahab, no rain, famine coming. And God sends Elijah across the Jordan. So first God sends him over here to the eastern side of the Jordan River. Go to the brook Kerith. You shall drink from the brook. I have commanded the ravens to feed you. Now, that term raven is a generic term. It typically represents a carrion bird in the scriptures. It makes you wonder exactly what they brought him,
I'm curious about that.
but
Steak and eggs. I mean,
at any rate, God provided for him. So he went, he did according to the word of the Lord, lived by the brook Kerith, east of Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. And after a while, the brook dried up. No rain. Well, that stands to reason. Do what?
I said, that's what he had prayed for.
That's what he had prayed for. But now continue on. The word of the Lord came to him and said, arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to where? Sidon.
Jezebel.
Dwell there, I've commanded a widow there to feed you. So he arose and went to Zarephath. So first God sends him from the region of Samaria over here to the eastern side of Jordan. And then God sends him way over here into Philistine or Sidonian territory along the Mediterranean shore north of Mount Carmel to the very idolatrous territory from which Jezebel had come. But there's a woman there. There's a miracle in the offing as well. He goes, a widow gathering sticks, bring me a little water, bring me a little bit to eat, a little bit of bread in your hand. I have just enough to make my son and myself something before we starve, which shows you that the famine didn't affect only Israel. It had the drought, the famine had affected Tyre and Sidon and the whole area as well. But in the meantime, Elijah says, go ahead and make it, just bring me a little bit as well. You think about the perception of this. Look at the wording here. Do not fear, go in and do as you said, but first make me a little cake of it, bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and your son. Had he stopped there, that would seem almost callous. Well, share what little you've got. We're all going to starve anyway. You might as well share it with me. But he follows it up. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. So he doesn't just ask her to trust him in blind faith, or obey him in blind faith, blind obedience. He gives her a reason, a prophecy. The Lord has said this. And sure enough, they didn't run out of flour. They didn't run out of oil because God was with them. So after this, during this time, her son becomes ill. So severely ill, there's no breath left in him, it says. And what does she do? Well, she's going to almost blame Elijah. Why? What do you have against me? You've come to cause my sin, to bring my sin to remembrance and cause the death of my son. What's her sin? We don't know. Was she an idolater? Probably, given where she is. But notice what God had said to Elijah. I have commanded a widow there to feed you. Had he spoken directly to her? Apparently not. Because Elijah has to tell her what to do. But in the interim, in the meantime, what does Elijah do? Give me your son. Carries him upstairs to an upper chamber, prays for him, stretches himself upon the boy's body, prays again and again, and the child revives. Brings him back to the mother. Look at verse 26, or 24 rather. The woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is true. Was there ever any doubt? She'd done everything he said so far. So if there was doubt, she kept it to herself. We would think that everything that he had done, that he had said, the fact that they continued to have food, we'd think that would be enough. But if it wasn't, here is confirmation beyond any shadow of doubt. You've restored my son to me. Let this child's life come into him again. He was dead. He came back to life.
Does the word sin imply that she might know Jehoshaphat?
It might. Question is, does the word sinned here imply that she does know the Lord? And it may. It may.
At least knows right and wrong.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Clearly you're right. Clearly she at least knows right and wrong. She understands compassion and care for other people and so forth. We find that in every culture, regardless of its relationship to God. But, human kindness is not exclusive to the children of God. Yes, sir.
Yeah, talk about with Ahab in verse 1,
Mhm.
when Elijah makes a statement, it says that it's not going to be dew nor rain these years. And then he
Right.
says, but according to my word,
Right.
it doesn't look like Ahab had more of an issue with him, and not so much as this is coming from God, but this is according to your word.
Okay. Go back to verse 1 in the chapter. Those of you online, Benji asked a question. In verse 1, when Elijah speaks to Ahab, he says, there will be no rain, there will be no dew, according to my word. So does Ahab have more of an issue with Elijah really than he does with God? Well, that's a good question, because when we look at the parallel account, what do we discover? Boy, Ahab has an issue with Elijah. Ahab has no use for Elijah at all in this circumstance.
I'll draw to your attention later on when he comes back.
Mhm.
Ahab calls him, you troubler of Israel.
That's right.
So there's clear personal issue here.
Ahab very much blames the messenger. When they meet, is it you, oh, you troubler of Israel? He's blaming the messenger very much. Now, does he not acknowledge God at all?
So acknowledge the nation's sin clearly.
Clearly does not acknowledge his own or his nation's sin. He's got plenty of other gods, supposedly. But the interesting thing is that in all of their interactions between Elijah and Ahab can't deny what happens. He can't deny that Elijah always tells him the truth, that it always comes to pass, that everything that Elijah warns him about takes place just like he said. He can't, there's no getting over it, no getting around it here. So now we come into 1 Kings chapter 18, and here's where it starts to get really interesting and entertaining in a way. I said Elijah in some ways is the most entertaining prophet of all, because we look at the contest that's going to take place on Mount Carmel, and there's undeniably, there's humor here. But before we get to that, after many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, go show yourself to Ahab. Well, here's James chapter 5, verses 16, 17, 18, giving us a divine commentary on this chapter. So just flip over to James chapter 5 for a minute and look at verses 16 and 17 and 18. And James gives us some insight into this. And if my pages will separate properly, I'll read that. You pick up at verse 16, James writes, therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. Or as the King James says, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much in its working. But then he goes on. Elijah was a man of like passions as we are, with a nature like ours. And he prayed fervently that it not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months, it did not rain on the earth. And he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. Now flip back to Psalm 66 for just a moment. Psalm 66 and verse 18. Notice what the psalmist says there. Psalm 66 is a psalm extolling the awesomeness, the greatness of God. And in verse 18, it has nothing to do with Elijah and Ahab directly, but there's a principle here. If I had cherished iniquity in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. But truly God has listened. He has attended to the voice of my prayer. That says something important about how we approach God in prayer. Now go to John chapter 9 and look at verse 31. And John chapter 9, of course, is the context of the man who was born blind and then healed by Jesus, had his sight given to him. We might say restored, except that he'd never seen before. And in John chapter 9, as the Sanhedrin, the ruling council, is challenging Jesus and challenging the man, interviewing the man. The second time, verse 24, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man, meaning Jesus, is a sinner. And the man answers, whether he's a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, I was blind and now I see. And they argue with him, they reviled him. We're the disciples of Moses, verse 28. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. And look at the man's response. You've got to love this. This is an amazing thing, the guy says. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Now, this man won his argument with the rulers. God listens. What did James say? Elijah prayed fervently and God listened. Come back over here to 1 Kings chapter 18. Now it's time for Elijah to pray fervently again. Which is not to suggest that he hadn't been praying fervently all along, of course. Go show yourself to Ahab, and I'll send rain on the earth. In the meantime, what's Ahab doing? Here's where it starts to get fun. Look at verse 2. Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. The famine was severe in Samaria. Ahab called Obadiah, who was over the household. Now, Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. And when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in the cave and fed them with bread and water. Ahab said to Obadiah, go through all the land, all the springs of water and valleys. Perhaps we can find grass and save the horses and mules alive and not lose some of the animals. They divided the land between them. Ahab went one direction, Obadiah went the other by himself. And as Obadiah was on the way, behold, Elijah met him. Here's where it starts to get fun. Obadiah recognizes Elijah. Is it you, my Lord, Elijah? It is I. Go tell your Lord, behold, Elijah is here. And Obadiah says, what? Are you kidding me? Sure as I go tell him, you'll disappear and he'll kill me. And here's where we start to learn just what things were like between Elijah and Ahab. There is no nation or kingdom where my Lord has not sent to seek you. And when they would say he's not here, he would take an oath of the kingdom or nation that they had not found you. For 3.5 years, what's Ahab been doing? Man, he's been hunting for Elijah, not just in Israel, but in all the surrounding nations. Ahab clearly blames Elijah. But wait a minute. Who caused it to not rain? God caused it to not rain. So why does Ahab blame Elijah? Is it simply blame the messenger? Shoot the messenger? Go back to the religious practices of Israel under Ahab. Who are they worshiping? You've got the golden calves, you've got Jeroboam's religion. But Jeroboam's religion was really established and set up and modeled on Israel, on proper Israel's religion, the worship of God. In fact, he even credited his golden calves with having delivered the 10 tribes out of Egyptian bondage. Behold, your gods that brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And their whole structure really was a mocking parallel of proper Jewish worship, proper Hebrew worship. But along comes Ahab, and what does he do? He imports Jezebel and the Baalim and the Asherim, the fertility gods. And what is the perspective of the idolaters toward their gods and the prophets of their gods? Well, they would claim that their gods are superior, number one. But the perspective, and we see this, it's sort of a subtext over and over and over in the interactions with these supposed deities and these false prophets. The perception is the prophet can command the god to do whatever the king wants. And so when Elijah says it's not going to rain because he has fervently prayed, and God says, all right, here's what we're going to do. There's going to be a drought and a famine. Ahab blames Elijah basically for not making God do what is good for him. So Ahab encounters Obadiah. Question here. Elijah, rather, yes, thank you. Elijah encounters Obadiah. And here's a question. What in the world is a God-fearing servant of the Lord doing serving in the court of Ahab? why in the world is he even still in Israel instead of having migrated with faithful Levites and so forth into Judah?
They're still his people, still care, still want
Okay.
to serve God, and probably wants to influence them where he can.
Okay, number one, all of those faithless, idolatrous 10 tribes are still who? They're still God's people. That's right. Not every German was a Nazi. Not every Israelite was an idol worshiper. What else is Obadiah doing?
Influence the king.
Well, he has influence over the king, at least to some degree. Jezebel seems to mitigate that pretty thoroughly. There you go. He's protecting, he's using his position to protect faithful servants, faithful preachers, faithful prophets of God. Now, is that why he accepts that position and occupies that? We don't know. But clearly, clearly he used his position to advantage for the cause of God. Serve God wherever you are. Now, there is perhaps, and I will say perhaps, an echo here in Obadiah of Daniel serving faithfully in Nebuchadnezzar's and Cyrus's kingdoms.
Is it not Elijah in the cave who's reminded, I've got 7,000
Yeah,
who haven't bowed the knee to Baal, so there's plenty of faithful spread. But
there you
plenty.
go. Elijah is going to be reminded, you're not the only one in all of Israel. And remember too, what has God done? God has sent a powerful prophet to an idolatrous nation that are supposed to be his people. So Elijah goes to meet Ahab, encounters Obadiah. Obadiah just say, what? Go what? You'll disappear and he'll kill me. And I've done this. I've been, why would you want to put me in this position? I've been faithful and supported these men and so forth. And Elijah says, you go tell your Lord, here's where Elijah is, and I'll be right here. I'll be here. I will show myself to him today as the Lord lives before whom I stand. So he takes an oath. I swear I will show myself to Ahab today. Well, that's enough for Obadiah. And he goes and tells Ahab. Ahab goes to meet Elijah. And here's that encounter. Is it you, you troubler of Israel? That phrase, that expression, that description is equivalent in its character and its impact to saying, is it really you, my enemy? Because you think about, how does the king, not just Ahab, but the king of any kingdom, think of himself typically in relation to his kingdom? Now we go to the New Testament, we have the relationship between Christ and the church described as what? Christ is the head and we're the body. In parallel to that, kings are often referred to as basically the embodiment of their kingdom. Ahab is Israel in a sense. And Israel has suffered because of the drought and the famine that Elijah prophesied and prayed for, that Ahab knows he prophesied and prayed for and has hunted high and low to get him for it. Is it you, my enemy? He's personalizing this in a very intense way, isn't he? I have not troubled Israel. You have troubled Israel and your father's house because you abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. You're the root of the problem because you turned away from God. Now think about the Apostle Paul's words to the Galatians over in Galatians chapter 4. As he's writing to the churches of Galatia, Christians in what amounts to north central Turkey in that ancient day, in Galatians chapter 4, he has some pointed things to say. Look at verse 12. I entreat you, brothers, be as I am, for I have also become as you are. You did me no wrong. You know that it was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you at first, though my condition was a trial to you. You did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Jesus Christ. What then has become of the blessing you felt? What's he referring to here? You back up, and what do we discover in the book of Galatians, in the letter? There were some folks that were trying to undercut his influence among the saints. And he's writing to them saying, wait a minute. Why the change of heart toward me? That's right. Look at what he says in verse 15. What has become of the blessing you felt? I testify to you that if possible, you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me. You ever gotten a speck of dust in your eye? You ever get if you wear contacts, have you ever had a contact just migrate way back up into the back of your eyeball? Had to go dig for it? Man, you'll cry a cup full of tears trying to get it out again, won't you? That's painful. Now, some commentators and scholars say, well, see, this is proof that Paul's vision was bad or whatnot. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I believe this is, if nothing else, this is at least a hyperbole that says, look, whatever my problem was, you would have suffered pain to relieve it for me. But look at the next verse. Have I then become your enemy by telling you the truth? They make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out that they may make that you may make much of them. He's talking about the folks that are trying to alienate these Christians from God. And he says, look, there was a time when you'd have given me your eyes. What's happened? Have I suddenly become your enemy because I'm telling you the truth? Well, here's Elijah. And what's Elijah doing with Ahab? Telling him the truth. I'm not the source of this problem, King. You are. And here's why. And now the proposal. Oh, here's where it gets fun. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Let's settle this. We'll have a contest. Get the people to, now, Mount Carmel is this little sort of little peninsula that juts out into the Mediterranean Ocean. This is the Mediterranean, this is the land. And Mount Carmel is, if memory serves me, about 500 feet above sea level, a level plateau at the top, a place where the bluffs actually run down to the water from that level spot. And it's a place that commands a view of the plains around where the people could gather. Now, will literally every person in Israel come? Probably not, but certainly the heads of the families and the prominent men and the elders of the various tribes, enough people will gather that the entire nation is going to be represented there. Gather all the people, and they gathered the people and the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And here's the proposition. How long will you go limping between two different opinions? This is a demand that Elijah makes. It's not a rhetorical question, it's a demand. Make up your mind. If God is God, commit to him. And if Baal is God, commit to him. But quit trying to play both ends against the middle. How are they trying to play both ends against the middle?
We can serve all the gods.
Okay, number one, we can serve all the gods, but then again, why is Ahab so mad at Elijah?
Get God to lift up this famine for us.
Exactly. I need you to get God to do what I want. wait a minute, if you're going to worship Baal, why don't you just go appeal to Baal for rain?
Which he's probably done for 3.5 years.
You're correct. He's probably done that for 3.5 years and no results. So Elijah's demand, make up your mind. Quit dilly-dallying halfway. Quit playing footsie with both sides. Think about Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6 and verse 24. No man can do what? Serve two masters. You cannot serve God and mammon. We picture that mentally as the guy in one sense trying to hold on to God with one hand and trying to hold on to mammon or worldliness with the other hand, as if he can thread the path between the two and have the best of both worlds, so to speak. Worldliness on Saturday and godliness on Sunday. You cannot serve God and mammon. He'll hate the one, love the other, hold the one, despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And we picture that as someone trying to hold on to both. There's a flaw in that mental image. What is it?
God's the one hang on.
There you go. God is not going to let you hold on to him like that. He's not going to hold on to your hand. He wants all or nothing. So he's going to let go. You're going to fall off the fence on the mammon side, and that's a mess. Go ahead, Mike.
I've never looked at it with that analogy. Nothing to do with it. I've looked at it as an analogy of two diametrically opposed positions. God, everything else.
Yeah.
I can only walk toward one and turn my back to the other. You can't.
There you
Walking
go.
to one is turning your back on the other, but if you want
Okay.
to walk to the other, now you've got your back. You can't do both. It's impossible to do both in a walk to two diametrically opposed positions.
Okay, good point. Two diametrically opposed positions. You can't walk both directions at once. And if you split the difference,
You're walking to neither.
you're not going to either one. Good illustration, good analogy. So Elijah says, make up your minds. Now, here's the proposition. He says, even I only am left a prophet of the Lord. Well, it's not strictly speaking true. You got 100 of them that Obadiah has hidden away. And God is going to show Elijah later on, it's more than just 101 other faithful people. But nevertheless, he's been the focal point. He's been the lightning rod. He's been the one that Ahab has hunted ruthlessly all this time.
He's the only one on the hill.
And you're right, he's the one up on the hill.
I'm it.
He's the one in the spotlight. Now you got 450 prophets of Baal. These are pretty good odds. Give us 2 bulls. Bring us wood, but don't light it. We'll build altars. We'll put one bull on one, put one bull on the other. Don't set anything on fire. All right, you prophets of Baal, if your God is so great, you call on him, you pray to him, and let him answer with fire from heaven. And I'll pray to the God who answers prayers. I'll pray to the Lord.
Verse 24, the people are going, yeah, that sounds good. Let's do that.
And the one that answers by fire, that's the one that really is God. And like you said, at verse 24, at the end of the verse, it's humorous. All the people say, hey, that sounds good. What a show that'll be. You have to wonder how serious-minded some of these people were.
I guess they came to the conclusion too, that either way, we're gonna see fire.
It's gonna be a show.
Yeah, we're going to see a show no matter what. Yeah. All right. Fellas, 450 of y'all, you go first. Choose your bull and do your thing. So they slaughter the bull, they put it on the altar, they put the wood there, and they begin to call on the name of Baal, and nothing happens. Yep. Lots of racket of them hollering and carrying on. Oh, Baal, answer us. And they limped around the altar that they had made. So at noon,
leaped around.
Yeah, the older translations say leap, but that is not necessarily the case with the word. At noon, Elijah mocked them. Let's just stop right here for a second. If you preach, if you are a shepherd of a flock, if you teach Bible classes and teach what the Bible actually says, sooner or later, you're going to bump into somebody that objects to what you teach because, well, that's mean. You don't have to be so mean about the way you say it. You shouldn't be sarcastic. That'll hurt people's feelings. You know what? Sometimes folks need their feelings just stomped all over with your size 12 boots because they're wrong. And it gets their attention and makes them sit up and take notice. And that's exactly what Elijah does here. Now, having said that, that sort of thing, sarcasm, mockery, has a legitimate place. President Zelensky said last week, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. That was a little bit sarcastic and brilliant. Mockery and sarcasm have a place, but they can never be properly motivated by bitterness, hatred, antagonism, other than a holy antagonism on the part of God and his word. And that's what we see with Elijah here. At noon, he mocked them. Cry aloud, he is a God. Either he's musing, he's thinking, he's deep in thought, or maybe he's in the bathroom, he's relieving himself, or he's on a journey, or maybe he's asleep and you need to wake him up. Now, every quality, every option that he gives them here mocks the idea that Baal could be a god. He's asleep. Our God never sleeps. He's on a journey. He's not here right now. He's a long way off. Our God is everywhere.
Probably a secondary in this because he's now leaving them with no excuse left for why Baal did not answer.
Yeah.
He now affect everything that could be an excuse and egg them on to go louder and harder and stronger, leaving with no excuse for the silence.
Point well taken. He has taken away any possible explanation or excuse that they might offer. So they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom, let the blood flow. And this went on until late in the day. As midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation. And there was no voice, no one answered, no one, and not only Baal, nobody answered, nobody paid attention. Can you imagine the rustling and the restlessness and the zip, 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 going on among the elders of Israel and the people gathered and the crowds watching and waiting for fire? Standing out there in the hot sun and nothing has happened? You can see their credibility meter just going falling on. Their poll numbers they weren't underwater. They were off the chart entirely at this point. And so before the day is out, probably mid-afternoon now, Elijah says, okay, it's my turn. Come near to me. And all the people came near. And he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. So apparently Mount Carmel was a high place that had been used to sacrifice to the Lord. And he took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of Israel. Israel shall be your name. Built an altar in the name of the Lord, made a trench about the altar as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed, put wood in order, cut the bull in pieces, laid it on the wood, fill 4 jars with water. Now think about this, fill 4 jars with water. Where do they have to go for water? Unless there's a spring up there, and I'm not aware that there is, they've got to go down the mountain and haul the water back up. And down the mountain and haul the water back up, and down the mountain and haul the water back up. Now, granted, the Mediterranean's right there, so plenty of water, could have been seawater. But they saturated everything thoroughly. And now it's time for Elijah to pray. Oh Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. There's a little tweak right there. You people call yourselves Israel after your ancestor. Well, he worshiped my God. Let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I'm your servant, and I've done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. Now, the prophets of Baal, even after all their frenzy, what did they get? Crickets chirping, sweaty, hot, and tired, bloodied. No true God could be talking and not also hear at the same time, or thinking and not pay attention at the same time. No true God could be preoccupied or pursuing something and not hear. No true God could be off in the distance on a journey and not also be present. No true God could be asleep. God is a spirit. Spirit never sleeps. And so Elijah offers the prayer of a righteous man in verses 36 and 37. And fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. And they seized them. And Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. They confessed that the Lord, that Jehovah is God. And then the false prophets are killed. Flip over to Revelation chapter 14 and look at verses 15 through 20. And what do you find there? That's what false prophets deserve. In Revelation chapter 14, you pick up at verse 15. Actually start at verse 14. I looked and beheld a white cloud seated on the cloud, one like a son of man with golden crown on his head, a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come. The harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple. He too had a sharp sickle, and another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over the fire, and he called with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,500 stadia. What's he picturing there? Judgment on those who have turned their backs on God. Well, what do we have here? Judgment on those who had turned their backs on God. And now the drought ends. The thing that Ahab had wanted all along for the drought to end, so that he can preserve his horses and mules, and have them to run before him like a king. Elijah said to Ahab, go up and eat and drink. There's a sound of the rushing of rain. All right. The drought's over. Elijah sends his servant. Go look out to sea. Go look out here to the west, to the Mediterranean Sea. Look for clouds. That's where rain typically comes from in the Middle East, from west to east, from the sea over the land. And he goes and he looks. Nope, nothing there. Go again. Nope, nothing there. Go again. Go again. Go again. Go again. Go again. Go again. The seventh time, there's a little cloud like a man's hand rising from the sea. In other words, I can obscure it with my hand. It's not a big storm front, it's just a little cloud. Go tell Ahab, harness up your chariot and run, you're going to get wet. And in a little while, the heavens grew black with clouds and wind, and there was great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel, and the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he gathered up his garment and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. That's pretty impressive. But he had God's help. And now Ahab tells Jezebel everything that happened. It's about 16 miles, by the way, from Mount Carmel to Jezreel. So that's quite a run for Elijah. Had God's help with that. Chapters 19 through 22 give us the relationship between Elijah and Ahab until Ahab dies. In chapter 19, the first thing Ahab does is tell Jezebel everything that's happened. And how that Elijah has executed her prophets. Well, you get a little insight into just how Ahab turned out to be the scoundrel scum of the earth king that he was when you look at her reaction. All that she gets out of this is not that her God has been humiliated. He has. He doesn't exist. He's imaginary. He's been shown to be a fraud, a figment of imagination. But rather than acknowledge that, what does she do? Get Elijah. She takes an oath. May the gods do so. And look at this. She doesn't swear by God. She swears by gods who have no power to confirm her oath. May the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them, one of the prophets you've executed, by this time tomorrow. You know, in the court of law, traditionally, it's not done very many places anymore, but traditionally, when you were sworn in to give testimony or to be a witness or even to serve as an officer of the court or as a juror or whatnot, you were supposed to raise your hand and vow or swear or affirm that you would serve faithfully or that you would tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And what was the traditional ending to that promise? So help me God. It was an oath in the sight of God. Well, we live in a secular society, so we've dispensed with God in the modern world, and they don't do that in courts anymore. But here, Jezebel takes an oath in the names of gods who are nothing but imagination. Several of our current federal representatives were sworn in, not with hand on Bible as a traditional promise of faithfulness before God, but with hand on Quran as a traditional promise of faithfulness before a figment of imagination. Allah is not the God of the Bible. Allah is not God at all. Allah is a figment of Muhammad's imagination and nothing more. Any oath, vow, promise made calling an imaginary entity to witness should receive no credit whatsoever. Because after all, what's the whole idea of taking an oath in someone's name, in God's name? If you don't keep the promise, what do? You bring the judgment of God upon yourself because you've called God as your witness. But if you call as your witness some deity that doesn't even exist, much less have any power to enforce anything, what's the penalty for breaking that oath? You're embarrassed because your God didn't take it out on you and vilify you for breaking your oath. Jezebel is still trying to maintain the fiction that her imaginary deities have any power at all. And look at Elijah's response. He was afraid and arose and ran for his life to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there, and then went on a day's journey in the wilderness. So he runs south to territory that's relatively safe because he's afraid. Why would Elijah be afraid of Jezebel when he has just been vindicated by the God of heaven?
Passion as we are.
Okay.
He's human.
Because he's human and she's mad.
She's a woman scorned.
She is a woman scorned, as the saying goes. And she's right there. God is right there too, but God is a spirit. We don't see him quite the same way he sees her coming for him. And so he runs. And look at the request he makes. He lies down and sleeps under a broom tree. An angel touches him. Arise, eat. There's food there for him. He sleeps again. And then there's more food. Arise and eat. You need strength for the journey. It's too great for you. And he went in the strength of that food 40 days and came to Horeb, the Mount of God. 40 days. He traveled a long way into the wilderness.
40 days, 4 of them. Seems like that's familiar.
Yeah. Yeah, our time is just about gone, so we'll come back to that next week. But he came to a cave and stayed there. And the word of the Lord came to him. What you doing here, Elijah? And look at his response. It's almost it almost sounds like a petulant child, doesn't it? I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. The people of Israel have forsaken your commandments and killed your prophets, and I'm the only one left. Now he knows on the face of it, that's not strictly speaking true because he knows Obadiah and he knows what Obadiah has done. I'm the only one left and they're trying to kill me. This is how you talk to the God who vindicated you at Mount Carmel with fire from heaven? How in the world can he talk to God that way? Well, think about this. How many times in sacred history and even in our own lives do we go from for lack of a better way to describe it, a mountain peak experience with God straight into the valley of despair? Because when we're on top of the world, so to speak, where's the devil? Boy, he is right there behind you. But when you're on top of the world, where are you looking? You're admiring the view. Oh, isn't this great? And you can let your guard down. And that's exactly when the devil has you in his sights. And so Elijah has literally gone from the mountaintop to the valley of despair, so to speak, even though he's on another mountain now. Emotionally, he's in the valley of despair. And what happens? Go stand out on the mountain before the Lord. Get out of this cave and go look. All right. Strong wind broke the mountains. Tornado, perhaps. God said nothing. Tremendous fire. Or earthquake. God said nothing. Tremendous fire. God said nothing. And after all of that, in the quiet, God speaks. The King James American Standard, the older translation, say in a still small voice. I like what the ESV says because we can relate to it. It says God spoke in a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah? What has God just done?" God has given him perspective, hasn't he? Not everything God does has to be profound and grandiose. Sometimes God's greatest power is exhibited in small things. God didn't speak in the storm or in the fire or in the earthquake. God spoke in quiet. And look at Elijah's reaction. I've been faithful, and there's he hasn't gotten it yet. And God basically says, all right, Elijah, you've had enough of a pity party. I've got work for you to do. Go back on your way to Damascus. When you arrive, you'll anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. Now, from Horeb, he's going to go way up here into Syria to Damascus. Go anoint a heathen idol worshiper to be king of a heathen idol worshiping nation. That's interesting. And then anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, to be king over Israel. And then anoint Elisha, the son of Shaphat, to be your successor. Which of these might give him pause?
Elisha, the end is near.
You might think Elisha, but what about Jehu? Because if I go anoint Jehu to be king, that puts me in open rebellion against Ahab. You thought he sought my life before. Woo, he's fixing to be really hot now. Well, that won't matter because apparently I'm leaving. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall put to death. The one who escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal and every mouth that has not kissed him. So Elijah, you're not alone. You're not the only one who has served. You're not the only one faithful left. You're not all by yourself. Oh, and by the way, the implication of all of this back and forth, who's with Elijah? God. God plus one is always a majority. God's a majority in his own right, but God plus one is always a majority regardless of what the odds are. Go ahead, Benji.
Even today, when you're busy doing things for others, you're not so much concerned about your problems and what you're going through. And so he has to contemplate this moment.
Yeah,
And it doesn't maybe have chance to think about all the things that Jezebel was saying, because
Yep.
now he's just busy.
there's a point well taken there. When you're busy in the Lord's work, your own problems recede into the distance, don't they? And it puts them in perspective, doesn't it? Consequently, the practical lesson, stay busy in the work of the Lord. And whatever troubles you have they'll be in perspective then. This is a good place to stop, which is good because it's time to stop. Questions or comments before we do, Jim?
Perspective. This is one of those things
Uh-huh.
I'll ask about. When we get to heaven, but I wonder if when God told Elisha there that he gave these three more things to appoint these three people, including Elisha, to take your
Mhm.
place. I wonder if that wasn't his answering Elijah's earlier prayer. When he says,
Okay.
it is enough. I'm no better than my fathers. I
Yeah.
wonder if instead of being like a little boy up the myth tree,
Right.
he's feeling that he's exhausted and he can't do any more for God because he's only human. So the best thing for him would be that, let me go on to my reward. whatever
Okay.
it is. Give me the peace.
That's an interesting point, interesting perspective. Go back and remember what Elijah's prayer under the broom tree was. Lord, just let me die. Okay. But first go anoint Elisha to take your place. From a humorous point of view, that may be a case of be careful what you pray for. You might get it.
This has always been one of my favorite stories. I love this thing.
Yeah.
There's so much in it, but one of the things that as you study it really draws my focus in is up on Mount Carmel. And you see what those prophets were doing
Mhm.
as, quote, worship, because offering sacrifices on an altar is a form of worship in that.
Right.
time. And you see them, and it's nothing but a spectacle, a mess, a made-up garbage, just hooting and hollering, fluting and flouncing around and slinging blood, and it's just a hideous mess. And yet in Elijah, you can see the God who says, let things be done
Decently
decently
and in order.
and in order.
Yep.
I am not the author of confusion, and when you approach me,
Yep.
reverence, respect, and decorum
Mhm.
matter. Elijah doesn't make a big show. It's almost like a stick. Lord, hear me now.
Yeah, there's a vivid contrast there.
Very
For those of you
obvious.
online, the point Mike was making, if you couldn't hear it, is that you see Elijah and the prophets, the false prophets on Mount Carmel, and everything the false prophets do it's a mockery of worship. It's centered around themselves. It's a spectacle.
showtime.
Yeah. And then when it's Elijah's turn, it's very calm. It's very matter of fact. It's very reverent
It was very deliberate.
and very
Elijah
deliberate.
was very deliberate in what he was doing, carefully putting the stones in place and all that, whereas, like Mike said, mayhem with the other guy.
That's right. There's a vivid contrast between worship of the living God, worship that's decent and orderly, and worship of these imaginary deities that's just a circus.
You
of
have
sorts.
to make it up.
Well, yeah, you got to make up your worship because it's made up God.
Make
That's
it up as you
point
go.
well taken.
But they were convicted though.
Well, you got to give them,
They were zealous.
points for their zeal and their conviction. Misguided as it could be, but
Bleed never
I mean, they were
worked.
bleeding.
Themselves, you cut them.
Right, I mean, a lot of times we talk about the apostles and disciples, that they would go to death because they were convicted. Why would do you believe in who Christ is, or they saw the resurrection? They would go to death because they saw that and witnessed that, thinking, okay, there's something different about these guys. If you come up and say, I'm going to kill you in the name of Christ, like, it was a funny story, and we kind of, converted some people. They're not really convicted. They were convicted at the point of death. These guys were convicted at the point of death. I mean, 'cause they were cutting themselves, their abundance of spirit, their conviction, but they were wrong. I mean, so you still have to go back to what the truth is. You can be zealous and you can be convicted, but it's still about where the truth is.
There's a good point you make there about the difference between blind devotion and informed devotion. These guys were, they were unquestionably devoted, but it was blind devotion. Elijah was informed devotion to God.
Zeal without knowledge is worthless.
Yeah, that's true. Zeal lacking knowledge has no value. Other comments, other questions? All right, then we'll call it class. Lord willing, I will see y'all next week.
It is, I mean, you're gonna nice, most of the time, class, you're right.